Welcome back, Crane Durham's Nothing But Truth, proudly on sale with me now, AFR Talking. Go to the Facebook page and check things out. Let me know what you're thinking about the show and some of the things that I'm posting. You could also, for the latest on the news story that you just heard, One News Now, onenewsnow.com. The news story that has obviously been occupying our attention throughout the day. 13 dead. Navy Yard, Washington, D.C. The shooter, including the shooter, the alleged shooter, the shooter would be Aaron Alexis. And our guest joining us every Monday night at this time is our good friend David Gartenstein-Ross, just back from his trip to Israel. He is a senior fellow at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. Welcome back, David.
Thanks, Crane. It's good to join you.
When you heard the president say this, roll it.
We are confronting yet another mass shooting. And today it happened on a military installation in our nation's capital. It's a shooting that targeted our military and civilian personnel. These are men and women who were going to work, doing their job, protecting all of us. They're patriots. And they know the dangers of serving abroad, but today they face the unimaginable violence that they wouldn't have expected here at home. So we offer our gratitude to the Navy and local law enforcement, federal authorities, and the doctors who've responded with skill and bravery. I've made it clear to my team that I want the investigation to be seamless so that federal and local authorities are working together. And as this investigation moves forward, we will do everything in our power to make sure whoever carried out this cowardly act is held responsible.
David, what did you think, and what does the information tell you that this is motivated by, in the sense that we don't know yet, we don't know if it's terrorism? The first thought I have is always it's terrorism, like from what we've seen and from the evidence of the events that have happened in the last 10 plus years. That said, I don't know if this is terrorism. I don't know what's behind it. But when you are an expert and this is your field, you know what motivates our enemy, what goes through your mind?
Well, first of all, what goes through my mind is the fact that when you have a crisis like this with news breaking quickly, there's going to be a lot of bad information that's put forward. You had a couple of misidentifications of the shooter. You had conflicting reports about how many shooters there were. First there was one shooter, then there were three shooters, and there were two shooters. That changed a lot throughout the day. Another thing that changed throughout the day is first one shooter was down, then two shooters were down, then one shooter was down again. This has been a typical example of how the news cycle moves, that facts are uncertain, and so there's a fire hose of contradictory information. I bring that up because it makes it difficult to know right away what's actually going on in terms of what kind of an attack it was, what motivated it. That being said, I think it's overwhelmingly likely that this was an act of terrorism, because you clearly did. It seems as though you had multiple shooters. I mean, this is something that has been reported by multiple media outlets. Even the vice president acknowledges it. If it's a workplace grievance, it's unlikely for a workplace grievance to involve more than one shooter. That being said, there are attacks that are not terrorism that involve multiple shooters. The Columbine attack is a perfect example of that. It wasn't terrorism because it wasn't politically motivated, but it was a two-shooter attack. It's possible that it could be something like that, but given that the shooter is identified as being 34 years old, I think that terrorism is the first thing I think of. Now, that of course doesn't necessarily mean this is an act of Islamic terrorism. I mean, you're referring to the past dozen years or so, but a couple of summers back you had a just horrendous terrorist attack in Oslo, Norway, carried out by a man named Anders Breivik, who was his ideology was an anti-Muslim ideology as opposed to an Islamic ideology. So I would hesitate to impute any sort of motive to the attack. But the first hypothesis I have is that this is terrorism.
And your advice to us in consuming the story, as we are, with our concern for the people that have lost their lives and their families, but also to know, because we're concerned if this is going to be a trend or not, is to say, put on the brakes, wait for things to be confirmed, and pretty much wait to get the right information in order to have the story and then an opinion. Would that be fair? I mean,
yeah.
Okay. Well, what do we do in talk radio? No, I'm kidding. I'm sorry. I call myself out on that stuff. Come on now. But sincerely, it's a terrible crisis. It's awful what's going on. But this is what gets me. There has been, I think some of this, when I think of it and when I see it, I go Islamic terrorism, and I'm looking that first. That's the first thing I see because of what's happened in Arkansas, what's happened in Fort Hood, the radicalization that we see, and also a government that seems to not identify the enemy specifically. And we've had that problem through 2 administrations now. So there is that frustration with the story being told and the political correctness element of things. Do you, as an expert, as somebody who has written books on radicalization and understands our enemy better than we do, obviously, tell me, does that ever go through your mind to say, wow, if this is terrorism, I hope they call it terrorism, Islamic terrorism in that sense, if it is Islamic terrorism?
In general, I see both sides of that, right? Like, on the one hand, there's a certain vocabulary the administration clearly doesn't like to use. On the other hand, it's not as though we're hurting for people recognizing Fort Hood or the Little Rock attack as being acts of Islamic terrorism. So, I hear what you're saying, and I do think that the administration has an impulse to not want to call things terrorism.
Mm-hmm.
I agree with that, the critique to that extent, but I don't think that societally we have a problem with not calling terrorism or Islamic terrorism what it is.
Okay. And policy-wise, and I know this is very obviously on the day of this tragedy, this is awful, especially with a second shooter out there, and that indicating it most likely is terrorism, whether it be Islamic or otherwise. So I realize that, but I also think it's an opportunity to have the discussion. So I appreciate your willingness to do so, my friend. Tell me, when you say society doesn't have a problem doing it, why does our government seem to be, well, I think they're reluctant to do it, and I'm speaking to the Bush administration, I'm speaking to the Obama administration, to identify specifically the enemy and have an open discussion about what they believe versus what we believe. David, do you accept my premise? Do you think that is the case, that our government, our society doesn't have a problem, but our government does?
I don't know. I think one can argue it more than one way. I think very clearly the Bush administration didn't, though. Certainly not in the first term. Their efforts. I have plenty of critiques of their efforts, but if you look at Bush's speeches back in September of 2001, they were very much based on the clash of the U.S.'s values with the values of Al-Qaeda and the Taliban. Going back to his very first speeches. So I think that those actually very much addressed what we believe versus what they believe. I also think that Obama actually largely does the same thing. I mean, if you look at the speech that he gave in Cairo during the first year of his presidency, for example, it was about, I'm sorry, that was the second year of his presidency, but that was very much about the U.S.'s values, and in contrast to Al-Qaeda's values. And he was looking for a rapprochement between the U.S. and the Islamic world, but it very much did contrast these shared values with values of the enemy. Now, part of the Obama administration's impulse, I think, is to try to marginalize Al Qaeda by not, elevating it as a set of values that we regularly debate. I think there is a very explicit strategy. You may or may not agree with it, but there is a strategy attached to why it does what it does. But I don't think either of them have really avoided the clash of values perspective that you're putting forward, and particularly the Bush administration very explicitly engaged in that kind of discussion.
I will concur with you on the Bush administration early on. The closer we were to it, we were willing to speak more honestly about it, with us or against us. I think the Obama administration, as well as the Bush administration, as it got further away from that event, and I'm a Bush lover, but I just see the language, and I also see the policy. I believe President Obama, from his standpoint, has tried to make it about Al-Qaeda as opposed to Islamic terrorism generally, and focusing in on that.
Yeah.
But we could debate that another day. I just wanted to get your point of view, and because you're so bright and so well informed, bottom line, I just like to hear it. Plus, I like to see if there's a little debate in there every now and then with you, David. Tell me something. When you see the Syrian solution that's been put forth and advanced, and put forth in the sense that... Yes, go ahead, please.
Okay.
Yeah.
Before we get to Syria,
sure.
I do want to discuss it. For listeners who tuned in partway through, let's just make very clear that the 2 or 3 questions you asked me there were very hypothetical questions.
Yes.
We have no idea who the shooter is.
Absolutely.
At this point in time, who the shooters are or what motivated them. I just wanted to make that clear to the audience, lest they think that there's more information.
Oh, absolutely. And pardon me for not making that point. Thank you for doing that, because I was taking it from there to another topic in general, of a general conversation. No, we do not. Absolutely not. Thank you, David. That's a great reminder. I see, this is why David has been on the show forever and a day. He's just that good. Tell me, David, what do we have in the form of the Syrian agreement, or the Syrian deal between Vladimir Putin and President Obama in securing the chemical weapons? Your thoughts?
Well, I think we have a mess. I think that Obama has gotten completely outmaneuvered every step of the way by Putin and everyone else in the world on this. I think that if you trace it back to the beginning, this has been a disaster. Obama laid down a red line on first movement and then later use of chemical weapons. I think that he did not think through what violation of the red line would mean. Once the red line was very clearly violated and you had hundreds of Syrians killed in a single day by the Assad regime's use of chemical weapons, the administration changed its stance basically every 48 hours, contradicting whether it would go to the UN or not, and whether it would go to Congress and what that would mean. Just very, very sloppy crisis management, shamefully so. Then you had Kerry's remark, which may or may not have been offhand, about how Assad could hand over his chemical weapons, after which Russia very quickly proposed it. Assad agreed to it. And now we have an agreement that it's going to be very difficult to verify Syrian compliance with this. And it's a good opportunity to put the pressure back on Russia diplomatically, but I don't see the administration doing that. I see Russia ending up looking like the winner and looking like they're going to play a bit more of an influential role in the Middle East moving forward.
And how does that impact Iran's ability to develop a nuclear weapon?
Well, 2 things. Number one, the term red line has only been used in 2 different contexts. One is in the context of Syrian chemical weapons use. The other is in Iranian nuclear development. Iran is watching very closely to see what violation of a red line means, and it's certainly not going to be too impressed with what it means. Secondly, Russia has, in addition to being close to Syria, been, at least somewhat supportive of Iran. And seeing Iran outmaneuver the United States in this particular confrontation, I think, is going to give Iran a bit more confidence moving forward.
How is it a game changer, if it is a game changer, that Iran does get a nuclear weapon? And do you think the administration currently and our leadership is resigned to that reality?
Well, I think the administration has been doing basically everything it can to prevent Iran from obtaining a nuclear weapon, everything short of going to war with Iran. There's been a lot of use of electronic warfare against Iran, number one. Number two, the sanctions and secondary sanctions against Iran have been pretty tremendous, although now, for example, the EU courts are striking down certain aspects of the sanctions regime, which is problematic. As to what it means, it's a much broader question. But among other things, having a nuclear Iran allows it to use nuclear alerts to really serve a deterrent effect against any country that it has a problem with, including Sunni states, including Israel. And there's the question as well, as given how small the Middle East is, whether you could have a miscalculated launch that could actually cause the unthinkable to occur within that region.
How you've just been to Israel? What's the tension, the mood, the feeling there about what's currently taking place in Syria?
Well, primarily, people working in policy would like to see the U.S. taking much more of an active role in Syria. But I think the Israelis are deeply ambivalent about Syria, given that Assad has been extremely hostile to Israel and part of the axis of resistance. But also there are a lot of concerns about what Sunni militants could do after Assad's fall. But overall, most of the Israelis I talked to many who are involved in policy making or analysis, thought that the U.S. government should be getting involved in punishing Assad for his use of chemical weapons.
And in the sense of punishing Assad for the use of chemical weapons, do you think with the advancement of the deal and what's lining up in the UN right now is it looks like that we are not going to be putting that within the UN resolution, therefore it would be illegal under the UN rule, and I'm blanking on the exact of 7, but bottom line, the threat of force will be gone. Do you think that has given the green light to Assad to say, okay, I'll play the game, but I really don't fear the consequences of breaking this?
It's a little bit hard to say. I mean, let's wait and see how it plays out in terms of a UN resolution before declaring what it means. I mean, I will say, though, that given how this process has gone, I think Assad is feeling pretty good about how everything has turned out for him.
David, we always appreciate your time. And as you're answering, I just think we'll just end up having a couple topics each week that we have to have more discussion, debate on. But I do appreciate the fact of your caution and the fact that when we are talking about something that in relation to the other story, we are not talking about that terrible event that took place earlier today, this morning, the 13 dead, including the gunman. And we were segregating that out. David, it's always a pleasure. Thanks for taking the time, my friend.
Great. Pleasure was mine.
Take care, buddy. All right, David Gartenstein-Ross. He is a senior fellow with the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. Now, David and I, just to give you a little background here, David just back from Israel, and David and I don't always see eye to eye, but I have a tremendous amount of respect for him and his opinion and where he goes with things and how he articulates it, and one of the best experts in the world, no doubt. But we'll probably see a little more back and forth and debating, because we used to do that all the time, believe it or not. And that's just a little insight of Nothing But Truth and what we've done over the years. 10 plus. Crane Durham's Nothing But Truth. Now, what do we do? Oh, I got something. I have something. Yes, President Obama, speaking of shifting to a different discussion, which was the reason for the speech in the first place, to be clear, President Obama addressed the shooting earlier in the speech, and then he went on to speak about the economic crisis. And here is the president, B9, please, B9, discussing the challenges of the current economy. Roll it.
Ultimately, our success will depend on all the innovation and hard work of our private sector, all that grit and resilience of the American people. Government is going to have a critical role in making sure we have an education system that prepares our children and our workers for a global economy. The budget Congress passes will determine whether we can hire more workers to upgrade our transportation and communications networks, or fund the kinds of research and development that have always kept America on the cutting edge. So what happens here in Washington makes a difference. What happens up on Capitol Hill is going to help determine not only the pace of our growth, but also the quality of jobs, the quality of opportunity for this generation and future generations.
But then he took it up a notch and went directly at the problem. And the problem, guess what? Republicans, roll it.
The problem is, at the moment, Republicans in Congress don't seem to be focused on how to grow the economy and build the middle class. I say at the moment because I'm still hoping that a light bulb goes off here. So far, their budget ideas revolve primarily around even deeper cuts to education, even deeper cuts that would gut America's scientific research and development, even deeper cuts to America's infrastructure investment, our roads, our bridges, our schools, our energy grid.
Okay. We'll have a couple segments this week in regard to the rest of that statement, as well as what's being set up for the showdown when it comes to the debt ceiling debate and continuing resolution. The president is expecting you, like President Putin did actually in his op-ed, to forget the record. And I say that because President Obama, in his policies, 5 years of all the policies moving forward, and somehow cutting spending is the problem. Even though, for example, like you go back and you review the record of what's been increased, and we're talking about going down to 2010 spending levels in certain programs. Spending's not the problem. Spending continues to be, or excuse me, cutting spending is not the problem. Spending continues to be the problem. But we've fallen for, I guess, the vast majority of Americans, in the sense of the election, a lot of Americans have fallen for the idea that government can create prosperity, and government must tax or borrow the money. They don't create wealth. They print it, but they have to tax or borrow, and that's a problem. We need to understand what the engine is and what we need to speak to in our values, which is freedom to use our God-given gifts. Our hearts and prayers go out to those impacted by the tragedy today. AFR Talk.